TESOL's Second Language Writing Interest section. The webinar will be recorded and will be made publicly available afterwards, so this is your notification that the recording has started. My name is Nigel Kaplan. I am the chair of the Second Language Writing Interest section. I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Christine Tardy as our presenter. Chris is an associate professor of English at the University of Arizona, where she teaches courses in the undergraduate English program, the MA-ESL program, and the SLAT PhD, which I hope means something like Second Language Acquisition and Teaching. Her research focuses, there we got it right, oh good, I was guessing that. Her research focuses on second language writing, genre and discourse studies, EAP, and writing in the disciplines. She's the author of a number of articles and books, including most recently Beyond Convention, Genre Innovation in Academic Writing from the University of Michigan Press, which is a fabulous read. And she's also the co-editor of the Journal of Second Language Writing. And Chris, help me out here. Chris was either one of the first or the very first chair of this interest section when it was founded.
I think I was maybe the fourth chair early on, but I was not
very early on. One of the founders of our group. Today's discussion is on the topic teaching to read as a writer. We encourage you to ask questions via the chat box on the right of your screen, and there'll be a Q&A later where you can join in with a microphone, but please keep your microphone muted until then. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to send us over to Arizona and welcome Chris Tardy.
Thank you, Nigel, and to all the organizers for inviting me to this. I'm very excited for the topic. Before we get started, I just want to check, are you all still just seeing the application and not the full screen of my slides? Yes, okay. I'm not sure how to change that. Can the organizer help me? You can see the full slide? Okay. I'm not hearing. Okay. I see that people are saying they can see the first slide, but it seems like you're not seeing the full screen perhaps, so I'm sorry. I guess I'll just power through with it. I do want to do full screen, somebody just asked. I'll see if I can minimize that a little bit. Maybe that's a little bit better. Please click the icon on the bottom left. I did. I see the application. Okay, well, I'm just going to power through, and sorry that it might look a little bit strange, but let me give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start with an illustration, and we'll talk a little bit about a sample text. And then I want this to primarily be a discussion, but I do have a little bit of kind of input that we'll talk about, a little bit of background on reading and writing instruction, and specifically on reading as a writer. And then we're going to talk about an application, and then I have some kind of open-ended questions. So I have to start by saying this is not my primary area of research, but it's something I've become really, really interested in the last few years, both in teaching early undergraduate writers and also in my graduate classes, which are not writing classes but are content classes. But I'm really interested in how we can help readers of all levels, or writers of all levels, use their readings as a nice source for writing, not maybe in the way that we traditionally think about it. So with that said, let's get started. Some of you might be familiar with the blog Prof Hacker, which is on the Chronicle of Higher Ed website. And I'd like you to just take a minute and read this blog post from Prof Hacker. Just read it as you might if you just came across it in the Chronicle or maybe via social media. So I'll give you a minute to read.
Chris, I'm sorry, the slides aren't changing for some reason. We're still on the title slide. I don't know if Michelle or someone can jump in. Oh, hang on a minute. Okay, we've lost your screen completely. I don't know if you can... There we go, that's better. We got it now.
You have the reading?
Yeah. And everyone, you can make your own screen bigger. You can maximize the go-to window if you need to.
Okay. So do you guys all see the text?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Excellent. Okay. So just go ahead and read it, and just read it as though you came across it as an interested reader. Are y'all able to see it, or is it too small?
Christine?
Yeah.
Maybe you want to try to go to slideshow or use the icon on the left bottom of your PowerPoint presentation. Either way, I'm thinking.
For me, it's full screen, so I'm not sure why it's not for you all.
I'm participating via my phone, so I cannot read anything you're showing.
Okay.
Because the app didn't work. So it might help to, if you could read what you're showing.
Okay. So it's a short text. It's about 5 paragraphs. It's called Strategies for Encouraging Effective Student Discussions. And it starts by saying, if you're not already following Jennifer Gonzalez's site, Cult of Pedagogy, I strongly recommend you start doing so. Gonzalez regularly publishes useful posts that provide specific advice for the classroom from K-16 to beyond. And then it describes very briefly this article, 5 ways college teachers can improve their instruction, and then it gives 2 examples of discussion features. The blog post writer says, I like these suggestions and I plan to work on incorporating them in my own teaching. Then it has some links to other Prof Hacker posts. And then it says, what are your go-to strategies for encouraging effective student discussions in class? Please share in the comments. Okay, so this is just maybe like a 500-word blog post. So my question for you first was going to be, what is the text about? And some of you were maybe able to read it. So anyone who was able to read it, can you kind of shout out just briefly, what is the content of this text? What's the topic? I can't hear anyone. I'm not sure if people are responding.
If you'd like to talk, there's a red and orange microphone button at the top of the screen with the chat on it. If you hit that, it'll turn green and you should be able to speak.
So if you can't read it, I can give you another way to think about this. If you run across a blog post that's maybe about teaching, how do you read it? How do people generally read a short text like that? What do you do when you read it? Okay, so someone had the topic, ways to encourage discussion, scan for highlighted text that tells me the topic, I scan for subheadings, I pay attention to highlighted areas. In this text we have hyperlinks, so you might even click on some of those links. Someone says they run through it quickly, the first sentence and the last sentence. So you might read a short text pretty quickly. You're probably trying to get the main idea. That's what a lot of you are saying. As you read it, you might be thinking like, oh, could I do this in class? Is this something I've done in class? How did it go? What's my personal reaction to this strategy? So you're probably also kind of processing it in terms of your own experience and so on. Okay, so that's the first way I wanted you to read it, just to kind of have you experience the way we usually read for information or for content. Now I'd like you actually, for those of you who can look at it, or for those of you who can't, you can talk more abstractly, to think about if you had been asked to write a post for Prof Hacker on the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Maybe they said, we'd like you to share an interesting article about second language writing. How would you read this sample blog post if you were reading it to get ideas for how to write your own blog post. And if you can't see it, it's okay. You can still share your ideas. You know, what would you do if you were reading it in order to write a similar kind of post? What are some ways that you would read the text?
I think I'd look at the structure of it.
What kinds of things in the structure, like the organization, or what sorts of?
Yeah, I mean, there were organizations, so it's got bullet points, it's got some things bolded.
Exactly.
I look for, how is this different than other posts on the same topic that I've seen before? How did this get published in the Chronicle as opposed to, you know, somewhere not as prestigious?
Yeah. So what makes this good enough to be in this environment? What might be different about it or unique about it? Anything else you might look for as you're reading in this way? So we have structure, bullets, maybe unique qualities, how it's organized, somebody said, references. Right, so when you read it this way as a writer, how is it different from when you read it for the information?
You don't read it for the actual information, you read it for how the information is set up.
Exactly, yeah, you're looking at it in a different way, right? So you're almost like at a meta level, right? You're looking at it for the textual features, for the discursive features, for the rhetorical features, and so on. So I think typically, you know, we might think of, some of you are probably familiar with Bill Grabe and Frederica Stoller's wonderful book, Teaching and Researching Reading. And they, in that book, near the beginning, they give us, hopefully you can see my slide, they give us 7 purposes for reading. These are kind of common purposes. And you mentioned a lot of these for the first time I had you read. So, you know, skim it quickly, learn something from the text, get general comprehension. In writing classrooms, we often use readings for numbers 4, 5, and 6, which are reading to integrate information, reading in order to write or search for information that we're going to need for writing, or reading to critique text. And those are pretty common academic tasks, and they're commonly the way that we might bring reading into the writing classroom. My next slide, I'm hoping that you all can see my slides at this point. It kind of asks, what do we know about reading, writing connections? So often when we talk about reading and writing, as I said, we're talking about these purposes of bringing information from the text to incorporate into a writing assignment. Ferris and Hedgecock, now in their newest edition of their book, they have a great chapter on reading and writing connections. And they note that effective research has shown us that effective reading skills predict and promote effective writing skills, both within languages and across languages. So we know that reading is really important for writing. We know that it can contribute to effective writing. What I want to focus on today is in the second slide here, the way that Hervela talks about reading contribution to writing, not necessarily as making us better writers, and not necessarily for just giving us sources of information to write about. But as he says, good readers don't just comprehend text well, but they also learn about writing through their reading of them. So as we're exposed to reading in different genres of different types for different audiences and so on, we sort of gather information as good writers for our own writing. And so it's a really great way to develop our writing skills. So this is where I'm going to give you a little bit of input, and then we're going to turn to using some of these strategies and ideas in a sample application. So I'm not sure if any of you are familiar, probably several of you are, with Alan Hervela's book, Connecting Reading and Writing, and it just recently, last year, went into a second edition. It's a really great book for understanding kind of an overview of work in this area. But he outlines kind of 2 orientations to thinking about reading and writing connections. And the first is what he calls the output orientation. And that's what we were talking about with the first way that I had you read, right? So you might be reading to gather information, to get material, to then write something. And in a typical L2 classroom, we're using text often as sources to practice writing. So we have to have students write about something. So they're kind of going to these other texts and then writing about them in some way. And they, of course, do that in their content classes all the time as well. So what we're going to focus on is instead this input orientation. Are you guys seeing the slide that says input orientation?
Unfortunately, we're still not seeing. Unfortunately, we're still not seeing the slides change, and I'm really not sure why.
Okay, I'm going to try something else and see if I can figure out. Let's see. That's not what I wanted.
Can you try sharing your full screen rather than the PowerPoint application? Maybe that would work better. Then we'll see what you're seeing. There we go. Perfect.
Do you see it now?
Got it.
Okay, great. Yay,
Yay.
I'm so happy. Okay, so you guys should see my input orientation. So I'm going to talk just really briefly about what this is and some strategies for it, and then we're going to look at some examples and try to kind of work through some applications. All right, so the idea of input orientation to reading is that it's, we were thinking of reading as giving writers a feel for the look and texture of reader-based prose, okay? So as input, reading is helping us as writers visualize what writing looks like. So if you want to write a novel, for example, you're probably going to want to read a lot of novels, not just for the entertainment, but to see how novels are structured, what writers do in good novels, just what you were saying about the blog post, right? Like how does it get published in the Chronicle? What kinds of structures are people using? How do I organize information? Do I use bullets? Do I use full sentences and so on? So, okay, so Hervala gives a really nice overview of strategies for this, and that's where I want to focus this time, because as a writing instructor, I have found that having specific ideas for what to do in the class is the most helpful part. So he draws on Donald Murray's idea of the reading writer. So this is the writer who reads as a writer, right? And Hervala outlines 4 strategies that we're going to kind of look into a little bit more. And I'm guessing that many of you use some of these, if not all of these. So one of our goals is to really get ideas from each other. So let me just give you an overview of those 4, and then we're going to dig a little deeper into them. So the first is what he calls mining. Actually, this comes from Green. So the idea of mining a text for clues about writing. The other metaphor that Hervala likes is detectives, which is also a great way to think of going to a text in order to sort of understand it and take clues out. The second is writerly reading. In this role, the reader is imagining themselves as the author of the text that they're reading, and they're trying to understand, you know, why the author might have made certain choices, predicting what's coming next, and so on. The third strategy we'll talk about is rhetorical reading, and that's when the reader is identifying specifically rhetorical features of text so that they can use those features in their own writing. And then the fourth strategy is the use of model text. And, you know, a lot has been written about model text in second language writing. So we're going to talk a little bit about some tips for using model text. Okay, so let's start with mining. Do you like the visual there? Hopefully you can see my miners. So the metaphor here is that miners go into a mine looking for very specific sources and extracting those so that they can, you know, be used for other purposes. So as miners do, writers can explore reading text for very specific input. So some of the things that we might look at as a student or a teacher helping students are rhetorical features of text, discursive features of text, and linguistic features of text. And Green, who, you know, this is not new, his work goes back to the early 90s, describes an ongoing effort to learn specific rhetorical and linguistic conventions, right? So incorporated into your class, these strategies that help students sort of work like miners or work like detectives. So what is your role as a teacher in bringing in the mining of text? At least 3 things. So first, providing meaningful exposure to certain features of the written language. So that kind of leads us to the second point. Purposefully selecting text that will expose students to the kinds of features that you want them to develop in their writing. This sounds pretty easy and straightforward, but for those of you who have tried it before, it can actually be challenging to find text that do expose them to the features that you want them to work on and that are also accessible text and fit with your task and your content and so on. And also the teacher's role is to guide the student's exploration of text. So again, and whether you use the metaphor of mining or detectives, you can't just sort of throw them out there and say, here, go look for things in the text, but rather we want to give them some kind of careful guidance in doing so, and probably start with just a few features or maybe even just one, and kind of gradually build on those so that they start to be able to use text in these productive ways. So that's mining. That's our first strategy. That's actually my favorite. I really like it as a nice tangible activity in the classroom. The second strategy that Hervela introduces is writerly reading. And this is a conscious use of reading for writing. So he says it's a type of mining, but the difference is what the reader's role is here. So in the case of writerly reading, the reader is thinking like the author. So they're trying to put themselves in the role of the author, and they might be asking questions like, if I were the author, what sentence might come next? Or what section might come next? What transitional word or phrase would I use to link to the previous passage? So as you're reading, this is sort of thinking of the text slightly differently, right, from maybe in terms of the rhetorical situation. What am I trying to do for my audience? What might come next? How would I predict what the next section would be? What choice I would make with this word or this grammatical structure, and so on. So putting ourselves in that particular position, or putting our students in the position of the author, which can also be nice to help them sort of think of themselves as authors. Our third strategy is rhetorical reading. So this is when teachers explicitly teach rhetorical elements, so things like maybe thesis statements or organizing paragraphs, topic sentences, claims, and then ask students to locate them in the reading. So this is a kind of mining. The focus is going to be on rhetorical aspects of the text. It might be especially useful for aspects of a text that differ across languages, across discourse communities. So for example, in some of the work in intercultural rhetoric, we might target rhetorical features that we know differ, maybe in disciplines or different text types and so on, and help students kind of pay attention to those rhetorical features. So the goal is often for them to, identify those. They might highlight, they might underline in the reading text, and then in their own writing, use or adapt those rhetorical conventions. This can also be a great way to just have discussions with students about the effects of altering these patterns. What happens if you don't use the conventional rhetorical pattern? What happens if you use a pattern from another community or another language, and so on? So it can be very productive in terms of raising awareness of rhetorical aspects of text as well. Okay, and then our fourth strategy is modeling, the use of models, and this is of course pretty common. I think a lot of us already use models. The research is pretty strong about the use of models in terms of learning genres and learning disciplinary writing. It pretty consistently shows that writers like seeing sample text, and that they like to use those as models to build knowledge with different text types. Also that it seems that when we draw their explicit attention to models, it can help them learn tools for using sample text on their own. And this is really what we eventually want, right? Our independent writers who use these tools of readerly writing on their own. So just some tips. I'm sure that you all have some, and we'll get to that in just a second, but some general tips when you're using models is to find models that are similar in task and genre to what the students are writing. That also can be challenging sometimes. Another tip is to include multiple models. One challenge with models, and I'm sure many of you have faced this as well, is that if students are given one model, then suddenly that becomes the template or the formula to do well on the assignment or the task. So we want to, if we can, include multiple models, and we want them to be a little bit different so that we can engage students in understanding the options that they have in their writing and the effects of different choices. And then finally, just like with mining, in all of these strategies, you can see they're focused, right? So we don't just sort of throw students in, look at the models, here are some samples, now go write your paper. But instead we want to help them focus on particular features of the models. So we might set up some guidelines for looking at models, might have class discussions about looking at models. But something that is a little, that kind of focuses their attention and they're noticing on maybe a handful of features rather than everything. Okay, so that's our background. Now, I'm sorry for those of you who are looking on a phone because this is going to be hard to read, but I think I'll read it out loud. And those of you who can see it, you can kind of follow along. So what I have here is a text from a short journal article in the journal English Today. I've taken the introduction, but I've cut it a little bit just for sake of time and to fit on our screen. So you've got the first paragraph of the article, you've got the first couple sentences of the second paragraph, and then you have all of the third paragraph, which is the final paragraph of the introduction. Okay, so a little background. The title of the article is, I Would Like to Sound Like Heidi Klum. What do non-native speakers say about who they want to sound like? So it's a short research article, and I'll read it out loud, and then we're going to try to think of, in this article, if you wanted to use this in a writing class, maybe you're using it for content, but you also want students to use it as a source of understanding writing. We're going to think about what are some features of this text. So it could be rhetorical features, discursive features, linguistic features that you might want to draw your students' attention to. So I'll just read it out loud. I'm sorry if that's annoying for those of you who can read it yourselves, but I want to make sure everyone gets a sense of the text. Okay, so it has a heading that says Introduction. English nowadays plays an important role in the political, diplomatic, commercial, economic, and cultural activities on the global stage. And then it has a list of references, C, E.g., and then 4 sources. As a result of the widespread use of English around the globe, several scholars contend that English no longer exclusively represents the culture of native English-speaking countries, nor are they the exclusive owners, in scare quotes, of English. See E.g. Widdowson, 1994. Sorry. More notably, English now serves as a global lingua franca and is increasingly used by both native and non-native speakers as a means of intercultural communication. It is perhaps not surprising that English is spoken in a variety of accents by speakers from different parts of the world. Okay, now I'm going to skip to the final paragraph. In addition, while native speaker pronunciation has traditionally been considered as a suitable model for non-native speakers, recently several prominent scholars, e.g. Jenkins, 2000, 2002, Kirkpatrick, 2007, have argued that native speaker pronunciation should not be the objective of the majority of non-native speakers, since they are more likely to communicate with other non-native speakers of English than with native speakers of today's globalized world. Given that pronunciation is an indispensable aspect of communicating in speech, it is worth understanding, the views of non-native speakers about how they would like to sound when they speak English. This article therefore reports on what a group of non-native speakers of English in Hong Kong said about how they would prefer to sound and who they would wish to sound like in English. Okay, so that's our introduction to this article. So what are some of the features of writing that you think might be worth drawing students' attention to in this text? So they could be rhetorical, discursive, linguistic. And you'll have to unmute your mics, I think, so we can hear you.
We've got some suggestions coming in on the chat box, Chris. Transitional devices, okay. How to use sources within the text.
Right.
I noticed the C, for example, CEG. Someone's suggesting, Josiah's suggesting an opening hook that is relevant to many people, many readers. Feel free to jump in on text or by microphone, everyone.
So let's hear some ideas for how you might go about this. Would you choose 1 or 2 of those? If so, how would you select, what would you select to look at, and based on what kind of criteria? What would guide your decision of which features to look at? Because you pointed out some really good ones that we might draw students' attention to. What kinds of things would help you decide what to examine in the text?
It'd have to be, who are my students first? Like right now I teach graduate students, so I would probably aim for some higher level things, and it would also depend on the point in the semester, just based on the other kinds of things that I would want to cover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what are you doing in the class at that time? What are the needs of the students that you're working with? Other things?
I think as well what they've been struggling with in previous writing. So if they, you know, are struggling with source use, then it's great to be pointing out the different ways that writers bring in sources. There's some other great suggestions on the chat here about looking at verb tenses, for instance, for reporting research, and then some structural issues, the CARS model, and general to specific information patterns there too. So some other ideas coming up there.
Right, so, and this would be a good one if you had taught the CARS model, for example, you could have them kind of apply it. Is this the CARS model? Is it a variation of the CARS model? So it's nice and short, so it helps us kind of, you can bring a model like that in and students can manage that. It's not too difficult. What kind of level do you think you could use a text like this with? What level of students in terms of both the content and also reading as a writer?
People are suggesting advanced students, graduate students. I actually think this is you could work this with slightly lower level, upper intermediate, several for upper intermediate. One person suggesting could even do this with high school or undergraduate students, high intermediate being suggested.
Yeah, so this in fact is a text that we use here at Arizona in a course we just developed this year, which is a pre-first year writing course. So it's for matriculated students who aren't quite ready for first year writing, the one semester credit bearing course. And their TOEFL scores, for example, are generally below 20 on the writing, below 80 on the composite. So, and we have used this successfully. It's a content-based course, so they're familiar with a lot of the vocabulary by the time they get to this particular text. But it's short enough and it has a lot of the academic language that we want them to start thinking about. So exactly the things you guys said, the use of citations, the use of transitions, the shape of an introduction, the reporting verbs, for example. So it's been actually a really useful text for them because it's interesting. So they're interested in the content. They can relate to the issues that it's describing, but it also is very accessible and can really help us look at some of those features. So a second question, because this is something that we struggled with in using in a content-based course, using text in this way. What kinds of ways do you think you might integrate having students, let's say, read this text for content, but also reading it as a source for learning to write? So what are some ways maybe that you might integrate those two processes? Because as we talked about earlier, they are different processes for reading, different purposes of reading. What are some things we can do in class to integrate those different purposes of reading? Any thoughts?
Chris, there's some answers coming up in the chat box. If you can, I don't know if you can you see the chat box?
I can see it if I escape from the
Oh, okay,
screen.
you can either do that or I can read stuff out to you, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, I can read it. So let's see, should they read for content and read for writing at the same time? Yeah, or should these be divided? So that's exactly the kind of question that we struggle with in our program here. So one person said chart how each statement builds on the previous. Good. And actually that can get at both the content and the sequencing of the text, the arrangement of the text. What are some ways that you can, that's a good example of ways that you can kind of integrate understanding the text, but also having them look at the text from that sort of writing perspective? Any other ideas for ways you can bring those two together? And someone's written, can they do this simultaneously if they're not advanced students? That's a good question. Should they be separate tasks since they involve reading in different ways? Someone says, I'd start with content analysis and then discuss the structural features. That's what we usually do in our classes, begin with kind of getting them to read for the main idea, helping them do that with maybe some vocabulary and some guided questions as they read. What, does that help so you can see that again? So we found, do some of you use reading guides or journaling, homework assignments? We found that integrating the reading for content with some of the reading for writing can be helpful for students so that it's not totally separate, but as they're, maybe first they read for content, and then as they're, you know, looking at the main argument, for example, so maybe identify the main argument, you know, what is underlying that language in the text? Is there a phrase that the author uses to make a claim? And can you find other phrases in the text that make a claim? So trying to bring together these two processes, because actually they're super helpful for reading too. Once you can identify language that introduces an argument or that supports an argument, it can help their reading for content as well as their writing. So it's a tricky balance between the, you know, kind of separating the two tasks, as you guys are saying, but also, you know, for sake of time, we don't often have time to just focus on the text first only for content and then maybe another day only for language. So trying to find ways to bring those together for students, whether it's through, you know, some classroom tasks, some homework tasks, a mix of those. I see people saying graphic organizers. That's a wonderful example of how you can bring together content reading with also then kind of focusing on how the text is organized. Guided questions, pair and share, templates organizers and templates can help to focus on both. Exactly. Do you have any other thoughts about this text and you know, what you might do in terms of some of the strategies we talked about earlier, the mining, the rhetorical reading, the writerly reading, and the modeling? Any other ideas on how you might use this text for any of those strategies? If not, I can move to my next. So highlight pronouns, awesome, for cohesion. Get students to rewrite the text about a different topic, so maybe borrowing the structures, that's a great idea as well. How can it be developed? Or write it in a different genre, exactly. Write it in a blog post, right? So what would remain when we put it in a blog post? Rewriting in that way, they're great ideas. So that kind of takes us to my next slide. Can you guys see my slide? I'm kind of flipping back and forth between the go-to meeting and the slides. Excellent.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, so we've got, the text I just showed you is sort of a standard research article. It's a pretty good example of, you know, fairly typical academic writing, and yet it can be accessible to a range of students depending on vocabulary and so on. But what are some other kinds of texts that you think might make particularly good sources of input for reading as a writer? So research articles are kind of an obvious example, but can you think of some other kinds of texts? And these could be genres, or they could be sort of parts of genres, but that you think are particularly useful for students in learning to read as a writer. What are some ideas you've got? Nigel, can you read them out to me? Because it's hard to flip back and forth between the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We're getting op-ed opinion pieces from the newspaper, letters to the editors.
Oh yeah, those are great.
You mentioned blog posts before. Those blogs from the Chronicle can be really fabulous because they often have very clear arguments in them. Case studies, if you're teaching graduate or MBA students, the Harvard Business Review case studies are really important.
Mm-hmm.
Any kind of mentor text, so I guess former students' texts could be useful too.
Yeah.
We've got lab reports if you're working with especially undergraduates in the US context, going into biology classes. Someone suggested winning essays for student competitions. I know our university publishes a compilation of the best undergraduate student writing each year. That can be great as a model.
Awesome. So let's take the example of the business case reports, because that's kind of a unique genre. So in that, what are some features that might be really useful to draw students' attention to? If you're familiar with the business case reports.
We've got the discourse organizing language. They're organized in very specific ways in the text. I would add the degree of narrative that goes on. There's a lot of narration in these, telling the story of the business. Linguistic features such as modal verbs, transfer, I think it means transition phrases, specific language chunks used in the field of business or the specific subfield, I guess, organization, marketing that the case refers to. So for maybe lower level students, how to write more full-bodied sentences that use adverbs, adjectives and transitions, so sort of more elaborated sentences. It's very typical of this writing. Sentence variety, ratio between background information to the case specifics, Estella points out. And I would point out the language used to talk about graphs and tables, because they're often integrated in these cases.
That's great. Yeah, and tables, graphs, those are really good things to sort of draw their attention to, not just how the information is displayed, but also how it's referred to in the text. So the meta discourse that we use for bringing readers to that text and making sense of the graphic. Yeah, and so many of the things that you said, even though they were specific for the case study genre, are really good features to think about incorporating when we teach students to read in this way. So, you know, the narrative, the meta discourse, the use of modals, perhaps as hedges, for example, the sentence structure and variation, the ratio of information in different parts of the text. So those are really useful features, very tangible features. And of course, we don't want to throw it all at them at once, but you know, what's most important for this text? Maybe what have they already done? We can kind of build on their strategies over the course of a semester or a term. So now I want to hear some ideas from your own context and things that you guys have already been doing. So I have two questions here. The first is, how can reading as a writer be integrated into the writing courses that you all are teaching now? And also, to what extent can your existing readings be taught as sources of input as well as sources of output? So I'm just going to put both of those up there, and maybe we can kind of discuss them together because they are related. So I'm going to flip. I don't know, if I flip back, I don't think you can see my slide. Maybe I'll keep my slide up. But if you can speak out, it would be great. Anyone have ideas?
Again, you can unmute yourself. There should be an orange button at the top of this, the chat screen. Some of the ideas coming up on the chat, Chris, are using the input as a sample, so a mentor text, sometimes using teacher-written samples, and using careful selections to introduce a reading and exemplify rhetorical style. That's what we've got up right now.
Awesome.
An interesting comment. This is playing to the crowd here, but you know, the challenge of when you're writing an essay, which I'll put in inverted air quotes, right? The reading input needs to be broader than just quote unquote essays, right?
Right. Yeah, so what is an essay?
Exactly.
But this is a challenge that often, I think, when we think about the source, the readings that we're doing in this way, it also challenges us to think of whether we are exposing students to the kind of writing that we want them to do. And when there's a mismatch, you know, is that an appropriate mismatch, or is there something we want to change in our either our selection of readings and or our selection of writing tasks as well? How many of you are already kind of integrating these activities in your writing classes? And if so, I'm wondering about that second question. Are you finding that it's, you know, are you able to use your existing readings as sources of input and output?
So my context is with graduate students here at Duke University, and we are actually very heavy on the input end of things. And so my challenge, and I'm sure this is true for everyone, is just, you know, how much class time can be used for the other part of this. And my takeaway from this, at least, is that I could take 20 minutes in a class and just try to orient my students to reading as a writer. I think that's something they definitely do not do, and I think it would be a good strategy to incorporate into what they're already doing. What I'm picturing is taking a text that we're already going to need for them to use as a model and to give them only part of that text and say, okay, now what is the writer going to do? And then give them another piece and just keep trying to, you know, force them to think about what is this writer doing as a writer first. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, that's great.
Natasha's asked a great question on the chat box. What would you do when your students represent different disciplines? How do you integrate examples when all your students aren't necessarily studying in the same academic field?
Mm-hmm. Well, I will let other people respond as well. I'll just say in the classes I've taught at the advanced level, that can actually be an advantage in many ways because so they can find their own text within their discipline and then compare across disciplines, and then they see what choices might be, you know, relatively common just in academic writing, and also what kinds of choices in a text might be unique to different disciplines. So in many ways, having them explore different disciplinary texts and kind of share and discuss with each other can help raise their awareness of some of the differences across disciplines. It is a little harder for the teacher because you have to kind of relinquish, you know, control. They're the ones who are going to go find the text, and they're going to struggle with analyzing the text. But it can actually lead to some pretty interesting findings and raising awareness of disciplinary variation. Have others, do others have responses to that question?
A number of people have commented in much the same lines that you just said there about using this to raise awareness about differences and different ways that that people write within disciplines, how discourse functions differently across disciplines, and maybe realizing that there isn't just one way to write is good for everyone.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So I'm interested, I put a third question up on the slide. What are some challenges or limitations to this approach of kind of teaching students to read as writers? What are some difficulties that either you've experienced as a teacher or you think you might experience as a teacher?
Some ideas coming up: lack of student motivation for writing. This is a time-consuming process.
Yes.
I'd add as well, so many textbooks, and actually this is the comment that's just come up as well, in many textbooks, reading texts are chosen to stretch students' reading skills, and they are way too difficult, way too complex, and frankly, stylistically beyond the average student. They just don't work as models.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So setting up expectations students can't meet. Jane is commenting on the same thing I was saying there. Cultural differences, The barrier of vocabulary when students read in disciplines outside their own, they may be familiar with the vocabulary in their own field but not in their classmates.
Yeah. So time, I can say, you know, when we've been trying this approach in this early undergrad writing class I mentioned earlier here at U of A, and time repeatedly comes up for instructors as a challenge, is how, you know, I don't have enough time in class to work on the comprehension of the text as well as the kind of looking at other features of the text. So our biggest goal is trying to figure out ways to integrate the two. And it does become easier for students, I think, over time. So thinking of how to make it a term-long process rather than something that is just done, you know, occasionally with one text or a couple texts, but rather throughout the course, getting them used to this process of reading for content. And as you're doing that or after you're doing that, going back to look at certain features of the text. And at first, they don't know what kinds of features to look at. So our biggest job can be really introducing them to some of those, whether it's linguistic or rhetorical discursive features, so that they can start, if they do that repeatedly, hopefully they can start doing that on their own a little bit too. Other challenges or limitations? Did anything else pop into the chat? Yeah, I like the comment that just came up. It's a pity to abandon a text once the content is dealt with. They are really rich sources of content. Someone mentioned engaging students in collecting their own small corpus. Absolutely. And that, especially for more advanced students, can be really a valuable resource as they move forward. Swift design can address the class time concern. Yeah, once they're more used to, you know, you can integrate some of this outside of class and some of it in class. Probably both the content and the reading as a writer, you know, needs to be done in class to some extent. So can I get a sense maybe from the chat, how many of you are doing this in your classes? Mm-hmm. So some modeling. It sounds like a lot of people are looking at sample text. Degrees, but yes, I do. Okay, good. Because my next question was, for those of you who are doing it, what tips do you have for those who might be kind of new to it? Like, what are your sort of best pieces of advice for bringing some of these strategies into your writing classes? Very specific questions. Yes. Don't give up, be patient. Yes, I agree with that too. It's often at first this is a little daunting to students, but they do become better at it, and I think they actually can get very motivated by it as well. Trust students. Don't try to focus on everything. Start with just part of the text, right? You can just have them look at an introduction or one text that has good development, for example. Yeah, so a lot of people are talking about being really focused and specific in the tasks that we give them. It's a great takeaway. Find out what your students will actually need to read and write. Yes, that might not be what's in the book. I think this, for those of us who are teaching in first-year composition, this is maybe the biggest challenge with especially existing books, is that the readings in there often aren't like what they read in other classes, and they're also not like what they write. So finding a nice match between the reading and the writing. Yeah, focusing on what they will later be graded on. So if your rubric has development in it, that can be a really good thing to focus students on. How does this writer develop their ideas? How do they support their argument? What is the language they can use to do that? Great suggestion. So the other question I wanted, for those of you who maybe haven't done much of this, maybe you haven't done it, or maybe you've done a little bit, but you want to do more, what questions do you have for trying it out? Like, what are the things that, you know, if you were going to start doing this next week, what are some things that you have questions about or want to know or want ideas on?
I guess what I see with my students, Chris, is that, you know, what they want to focus on is vocabulary, because it's the most obvious thing that they don't understand, and what they do is they just translate all the words they don't know, which ends up with a list of words they didn't know, right? So it's how to get them beyond that sort of knee-jerk reaction of looking up every word, which, you know, I understand, into looking at text differently. And there's other questions coming up as well there.
Mm-hmm. Strategies for encouraging students from one discipline to focus on a text from another. How much time would be required to understand the input and then use it for output? Yeah, and Nigel's question, how do we get them beyond just the focus on vocabulary? Have students compare the genres they learn in their writing classes with genres in their discipline. That's great. For example, they might learn comparison contrast in their writing class. They can look for genres in their discipline that use that. Or even look for assignment prompts from their other classes that might use some of those strategies. Yeah, the vocabulary is, so Nigel, what do you do for that? Share us your strategy for that challenge.
I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, especially for a text that is really challenging, it's hard to get them beyond that. One thing that I have found motivates my students to look at the text in different ways is to connect it to the assignment rubric. So if they know they're going to get graded on certain things, like development of ideas is a good example. Use of other sources is another good example. Where they know that's part of how they'll be assessed in their writing, then we can use the specific items in the rubric to look at the text that we're using in the class and see how those writers do that. And again, we try to, so that's one way to just avert their attention from always focusing just on the vocabulary, but also using vocabulary, and I'm sure you do this as well, as something that they can mine text for. So, you know, what are some of the synonyms here? Why did the writer use this word instead of this alternative synonym? And looking at like formality and those sorts of things. So that sometimes, like, yes, let's focus on vocabulary, and maybe not just in terms of words, but also the common bundles and so on, so that they do feel like you're addressing that issue as well, because vocabulary is super important. What does it mean to develop ideas? Somebody asked in the chat. The concept may be challenging. Exactly. When we say develop ideas, what are we talking about? And I mean, students really like looking at exactly how someone takes an idea in a paragraph and adds to it and gives an example and gives a citation, counters it, extends it. But if they can kind of start looking at those patterns repeatedly, they might develop some resources for their writing. And having them explicitly talk about it or write about it in a homework or a journal. Someone has a great suggestion in the chat about pairing them with students from same or related fields so that they can focus their attention on relevant features within their discipline and work as both a reader and writer. That's a nice idea. The most challenging thing is getting them to ask questions and make connections. Someone has written, use text like corpora, absolutely. So, and some of you may be familiar with Megan Cizik and Gina Bennett's great article, good chapter in the book by Margie Wald and Mark Roberge, and I think somebody else. It's the multilingual, I'm not going to remember the title. Can someone help me? It's the University of Michigan book. It came out in 2015, and it's something like U.S. educated multilingual writers. And anyway, they have a wonderful chapter that is called Students as Language Detectives, and it gives a lot of ideas for using even some corpus tools, but using the text that students are encountering for learning vocabulary, for looking at different patterns of text in terms of maybe lexical, grammatical features, and so on. So that's a great article that I would suggest if you like the idea of bringing in corpus materials too. Yes, thank you, Nigel. Yes, and Kay Lucy. So I'll put the authors with Megan, Isaac, and Gina. Yeah, bundles and collocations, absolutely. So lots of ideas here. Are there any last minute questions that people want to ask, or pieces of advice? It seems like if I'm to kind of summarize the content, people are doing really interesting things. The challenge is often time and motivation for students. So finding ways to make this interesting for them and help them kind of see the relevance. But also, I mean, a real goal is so that they start to do this on their own as writers, because I'm guessing that many of us, if not all of us, do this as we read, even in a very familiar genre. We become kind of attuned to language, and that's something that we want to, inspire our students to do as well. Questions? I like the comment that just came up, seeing a difference between monolingual versus multilingual writing.
All right, well, I think we'll say a very big thank you to Chris for joining us and leading this webinar. We'll be archiving this on the TESOL YouTube site very soon, as soon as the recording's up, and we'll be continuing webinars like this throughout the year. If you're not already a member of the Second Language Writing Interest section, do join us through the TESOL website. Thank you again to Chris for your time and for these fantastic suggestions, and have a great week, everyone. Bye wherever you are.
Thank you, Nigel, and everybody for your participation.